Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to this yet another edition of the Soft Cover, a Print's initiative for book launches. You're well aware that India has fought 4 conventional wars, which was in 47, 62, 65 and 1971. However, the Indian military, I'm talking about the Indian military, and by Indian military I mean the Army, the Air Force and the Navy, have been engaged in multiple military operations since then. And today in Soft Cover we're launching the book Full Spectrum by Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. The book, published by Harper Collins, looks into the operations that the Indian military has carried out since 1972. And I have with me Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam. Welcome to ThePrint, sir. Welcome to the Soft Cover.
Thanks, Nesh.
Before we start, we launched this book, and so that you're able to see the contents of this book. Well, there you go. This is the Full Spectrum, India's Wars 1972 to 2020 by Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. Sir, to begin with, why this book?
Why this book is pretty simple is that, my first book, India's Wars, A Military History from 1947 to 1971, was actually a shot in the dark. And I was surprised by the kind of interest it generated, not only amongst military readers, but amongst young readers from across the section of society that wanted to know more about the Indian military.
Yeah.
And when I met a couple of readers, they immediately asked me, I hope you're not going to stop here. And that's when I realized that I think the impact of this series will only be fully felt if I manage to write the sequel to that book and end it up as recently as I probably could.
Of course, the book, for that matter, even talks about the ongoing standoff between India and China. And as I mentioned, this book looks at the military operations since 1972. And the military operations, of course, are the Naga and Mizo insurgencies, right from the Operation Blue Star in Punjab to the Siachen conflict, and even multiple skirmishes and standoffs that India had with China. And I must tell you, viewers, that I was actually traveling through Kashmir last week, the entire southern and the northern Kashmir, and this book also dwells into the history of the Kashmir conflict. And sir, I must tell you that while in Kashmir, of course, the first part that I read was the history of the Kashmir thing, the Kashmir situation, and this book reveals a lot about how the Kashmir problem originated. While everybody usually thinks that the Kashmir problem was something that originated post the elections of 87, which were rigged, and there was a large uprising against it. But this book reveals that the actual seeds of discontentment was sown by the Pakistani, the ISI, much earlier.
Yeah.
And the election in 87 was just a catalyst for the entire situation to explode. So, one of the first operations, of course, you talk about Naga and Mizo insurgencies, and then you of course come to the Operation Blue Star. And Operation Blue Star shows a lacunae in the way that the Indian Army planned the operations. It also showed for the fact that the generals, the top commanders who were in charge of the operations, somehow, they succumbed to the pressure that was there from the Prime Minister's office. At that time, of course, Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, very strong lady.
Yep.
But how important at times, when such situations is important for the soldiers, the generals who are commanding the men, to speak out and tell the government what is right and what should be done.
No, Operation Blue Star, I have been very, very candid, and I have interviewed a whole lot of people who were involved in the operation. General Katoch.
Yeah.
There have been a few officers, people like Lieutenant General Ghai who've expressed themselves very, very sort of cogently on Operation Blue Star. The issue here was, it is not that the army had not provided the right advice to the political establishment. It is just that the army leadership did not sustain that advice over a period of time. If you recollect, I begin the chapter by talking about Lieutenant General S.K. Sinha,
Yes.
the Vice Chief of the Army Staff, who was asked by the Chief Minister Darbara Singh to Russian army troops in order to support the police when they first went in to capture Bhindranwale.
Yeah.
General Sinha put his foot down and said that this is not an army operation, and therefore one must use the army with care when one comes to an operation which is in urban terrain.
Yeah.
So the first the first challenge that the Indian Army had to face, and it needed to be actually prepared to do that, was whether the Indian Army at that stage was equipped to conduct operations in densely populated urban terrain. It was not. But there was a misplaced sense of confidence that the adversary was not as strong as he eventually turned out to be.
Yeah.
And that the operation could be finished earlier than later.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is right, that there was not adequately considered advice given to the political establishment. If you recollect, Operation Black Tornado took place a few years later.
Yeah.
Now, it was mainly a well-considered intelligence operation supported by the Punjab police and the special group of the NSG. The other issue was that at that moment in time in 1984, the NSG was not there.
Yeah.
So if the NSG had been there, I'm sure that the government of India would have requisitioned the NSG to mount the operation rather than the Indian Army, which actually brought in regular infantry formations that were not fully equipped to conduct
and also from outside rather than from the same area.
Exactly. So yes, it was an operation that much was learnt from.
This book, and many of my age, who are younger than would not be aware, would not be aware of the Punjab insurgency and the operations that was carried out. And it is interesting to note, viewers, in this book, and this book gives you a lot of details that is lesser known. For example, even when we talk about Operation Blue Star, it speaks about the fact that it was Major General Shabeg Singh, who was from the 1 para and who had joined Bhindranwale, and it was his planning that really made the Golden Temple into a fortress. Yeah. So so if someone is interested in the history, and it's very important that to understand the current context and where the operations, how the operations are held and the changes, it's very important to understand the history. And this book does reveal a lot of insight into operations that have been done in the past. Yeah. So another operation that books really stands out and gives very intricate details, many of the details which I was not aware of, was the infamous IPKF operation. Again, what this book, when I read the chapters through it, again I felt that this was something that the Indian military, jumped into without any actual intelligence or without any actual planning on the ground. And I suppose you spoke about the overconfidence that was there, and this book also talks about the overconfidence in the IPKF, where they thought that they would just get in and get the job done. And this IPKF movement changed from a peacekeeping to a peace enforcer operation.
Counter-terrorist operation, right? Peace enforcement, counter-terrorism operation. You have to once again look at the military and the geopolitical situation at that particular time. It's not that the Indian Army had not gathered adequate amount of counterinsurgency experience. It had already been fighting for some years in the northeast, and the terrain in the northeast, the terrain in some of the jungles of Sri Lanka were quite similar.
Yeah.
There were formations that were very well trained for counterinsurgency operations, like for example 57 Mountain Division. I write about 57 Mountain Division that moved from the northeast to Batikalova.
Yeah.
And they were amongst the better performing formations in Sri Lanka because they were already familiar with counterinsurgency operations.
But they moved later.
They moved later. And now, if you look at it, 54 Division, which first moved in, was actually trained and equipped, and General Sundarji had looked at it as his expeditionary or his out of area contingency formation, and it was a formation trained for conventional operations. But then when the ISLA was signed and it was a peacekeeping operation that was envisaged, General Sundarji decided to send 54 Infantry Division with its headquarters from Hyderabad into Sri Lanka. And I think that was a decision that probably he ruled subsequently about not choosing his formations carefully before sending them first.
Yeah.
And more importantly, we underestimated the adversary, and we did not anticipate that the LTT would not stick to its word that it gave to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And so, more than to my mind, more than the operational failures, it was also may have been strategically the right move at that particular time if India wanted to expand its influence. But we didn't have the capability enough to be able to translate that desire to expand influence into actual operations on the ground.
While we look at these two operations, the Operation Blue Star as well as the IPKF, in which in the hindsight you realize that it could have been done in a much better way. Lives could have been saved. It was handled badly at multiple levels. I'll not blame just the military, but even at the political level. But one of the finest operation, and this book talks about it, is the Siachen conflict, and how the Indian Army went ahead and captured Siachen, taking the Pakistanis by surprise. If you could tell our viewers about how exactly did the Indian Army go ahead and do that, sir?
Interest from both Pakistan and India over the Siachen Glacier has existed from the 70s, late 70s.
Yeah.
There were mountaineering expeditions from both sides that went in. But it was only, again, it was some good piece of intelligence stitching together that told General Chibber, the Northern Army commander, to say that, look, Pakistan is busy scouting for winter clothing, and that there is an operation that is being planned to occupy Billafondla and Siala on the Saltoro Ridge.
Viewers, it would be interesting to note that how did the Indians actually come to know about that Pakistan was planning an operation to capture the Siachen Glacier, and this book talks about it, is the fact that India was procuring high altitude winter clothing for its soldiers, and from abroad. And Pakistanis, and this book reveals that the Pakistanis had actually contacted the company that Indians had contracted for and were offering higher price. And that's how the intelligence came in, that the Pakistanis were offering higher price, and that's when the Indian military leadership realized that Pakistan was actually planning an operation. Please go ahead, sir.
And at that time, there were a set of fairly aggressive military commanders in charge. Okay, you had General Chibber, who I would say was one of our earliest soldier scholars, very very prescient about happenings in Jammu and Kashmir. We had General Handu, who was the corps commander in 15 Corps. You had General Shiv Sharma, who was the GOC of 3 Division. You had Bull Kumar, Colonel Narendra Kumar, who was the Everester and the mountaineer, who was actually doing a lot of mapping and doing a lot of expeditions in the Teram Kangri region towards Indira Kol. And therefore they had an excellent team to plan the operation. The operation was planned in secrecy, and it is believed, though the Pakistanis have never admitted it, but simultaneously when the Indians were mounting Operation Meghdut, there was another operation being mounted from the Pakistani side, and I think the Indians beat the Pakistanis to the Saltoro Ridge by a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
and those couple of weeks made all the difference. And I've got a section also which highlights the Indian Air Force from 1978 onwards.
Yes.
Air Vice Marshal Bahadur was amongst the was a young flying officer, and he was amongst the first to land on the glacier to carry out casualty evacuation of Bull Kumar's expedition, one of the members who fell sick.
Yeah.
So Siachen is one of India's most successful preventive or preemptive military operations that it has conducted.
Absolutely, and there's no doubt about it. And another operation which always comes to everybody's mind about successful Indian Army operations, or for that matter Indian military operations, is the one that we did in Maldives. Yeah. This was when a coup was being attempted by one of the businessmen, against the president, and with support of LTT cadres. And I've always known this operation as to be one of India's finest. But this book also shows that, reveals the inside details of how the operation was planned. And it also reveals the fact that there were a lot of missing links. In a way, this operation could have gone horribly wrong also.
Yeah. And
I'll read out, some of the examples from this chapter. It is very interesting. So initially, while of course the para commandos went into Maldives, there was also an attempt to send the NSG, and the NSG was being sent by our external intelligence agency. And this book says that, at that time Chidambaram was the Home Minister, and that an AN-12 from the Aviation Research Center, controlled by the Home Ministry, was already airborne from Delhi with NSG commandos and on course for Malé, only to abort the mission when it realized that it did not have the fuel to get to Malé. Now, how do you look at this operation, sir?
The Maldives operation was an audacious operation. Again, it was the first. India's para brigade had been used, of course, in Bangladesh, but never in an out of area contingency operation. It was the first attempt at which India successfully showcased that it was willing to take on responsibility in the region and come to the assistance of smaller countries when asked for. The operation was launched with secrecy, with stealth, and with speed. But along with that secrecy, stealth, and speed also came the glitches that are associated with an operation that is conducted for the first time. Also this AN-12 operation is nowhere chronicled. Okay. So therefore, it is something that has come in because somebody pretty reliable. I managed to speak to that person, and they said probably there was an AN-12 already en route with NSG. So my ears perked up to that particular comment. Now the wind pattern during that time must have ensured that the crew realized that they will not be able to reach, and they did not want to refuel anyway, because then the secrecy of the situation of the operation would give way. Luckily, the Vice Chief of the Army Staff and the Vice Chief of the Air Staff had already tied up for the para brigade to be ready in Agra and for the IL-76s to be ready. So while there were glitches in the operation, but there were adequate redundancies, and there was a lot of flexibility and innovative thinking from the Indians to ensure that the operation was a success. But having said that, even Group Captain Bevoor admits that it was a successful operation, but with a lot of luck.
Yes, indeed. I would, this book also talks about the standoffs that India had with China. And I'm sure, even I and rest of the viewers would want to hear more of China. But that before I pick up the issue of China, this book also delves very deeply into the issue, the Kashmir issue.
Yes.
And if you could, everybody looks at Kashmir in the present spectrum of things, about the fact that you have terrorism there. Now Article 370, has been removed. You also have the state which has been divided into 2 union territories. But when you look back at the history of Kashmir and the history of this issue, what is the learning that you get and what is the feeling that you get from the world? Did we commit any mistakes in the past? Could we have handled it in a different way? How do you see that, sir?
No, I think it's very difficult to encapsulate Kashmir in an answer to a question like this.
True, fair enough.
However, let me give it a try. Kashmir is a complex issue that the Indian political establishment and the military have attempted to address in the best possible manner given the circumstances of the situation. And I think the trajectory that it has followed is that initially there has always been an inability to understand the ground swelling of secessionist tendencies, which has then reached a tipping point, which has resulted in the police forces or the local law and order mechanisms in Jammu and Kashmir not being able to handle the situation, and the inevitability of requisitioning the Indian Army and the central police forces to come in to sort of stabilize the situation. Generally, when this situation has been stabilized, I've written in the book, when General Malik was the chief of the army staff, he went back to the chief minister and said that, look, the Indian army has done its job, it's time now for you to start kick-starting.
And this was which year, sir, for the viewers?
This was in 1997.
Okay.
1997, as soon as he took over as the army chief.
97, yeah.
97. And what happened? The chief minister picked up and made a panic call to the prime minister. And the army and General Malik was told, okay, no, the army will remain. There needs to be a little more work that needs to be done. So therefore, we have missed this. We've continued in this vicious cycle repeatedly. There have been several occasions when I think the army has done its job in terms of curbing terrorism and paving the ground for improved civic sort of influence. When that has not been forthcoming, the vacuum has been once again filled by secessionists and terrorists, every time with greater support from across. And therefore the intensity of the proxy war has only become worse as time went by, because the proxy actor or the hybrid actor always manages to work inside the OODA loop of the established state. So they became nimbler and nimbler, and the state remained slow. So I think in that respect, there has been a genuine attempt to change the game. Now once again, that changing game has to now be converted into a new normal. That's going to be the biggest challenge.
That is going to be the biggest challenge.
It's not going to be how the military tackles the remnants of separatism or terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. It's what follows after that, which is going to determine the course of Kashmir over the next couple of years.
What the civil side of the state does, the civil government side of the state does.
I won't even say civil side. It has to be a holistic combination of all elements of statecraft that have to operate simultaneously for good effect.
So this, I've reported from Kashmir, and we had the 15 Corps commander saying that, while yes, the recruitment has gone up in comparison to last year, the number of terrorist kills is also significantly high. But the Corps commander said that the army they will work more on ensuring surrenders take place. And he's on record in saying that, just because you've picked up a gun, clicked a picture, doesn't mean you have to die. And the government is also trying to come out with a surrender policy. Of course, the surrender policy exists, that is for the earlier terrorists who had crossed over to Pakistan. But a surrender policy is being worked for the current generation of youth who've joined terror groups. Is this the way forward, sir?
Of course. I would believe that if rolled out well, if backed up with post-surrender rehabilitation, I think it can be a game changer. And it has been attempted in the past also. But somehow we have not been able to sustain that cycle of converting surrenders into meaningful, post-surrender contribution of those youth to the state.
To the state.
In fact, General Zaki,
Yeah.
even in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a very comprehensive surrender policy was rolled out, but it was not followed through.
True, and he also talks about the fact that in the 80s it was about winning hearts and mind. That what the army focuses now is something that was first envisaged in the late 80s. There, right? So this book talks about.
Again, this is something which is very close to my heart.
Yeah.
I always say that winning hearts and minds has become a buzzword in counterinsurgency operations thanks to some writing that has emerged from the West. I mean to say, David Petraeus rolled out that policy in Afghanistan, and people like John Nagel and David Kilcullen have written a lot about counterinsurgency operations, and so therefore so the West has seized ownership of winning hearts and minds. But actually, if you go into history, winning hearts and minds is a strategy that was articulated by the Indian Army as early as 1957 when the Indian Army moved into Nagaland.
Okay.
If you read the para that I've written about the message, the chief's message when General Sri Nagesh was the chief of the army staff to troops that were going into Nagaland, that was the origins of winning hearts and minds strategy. And then in 1984, General Chibber, when he was the army commander of Northern Command, he laid out several commandments that conform very, very closely to what is today's winning hearts and minds strategy.
Sure.
And then General Joshi had these 10 commandments that every soldier had to carry. So I think the Indian Army rightfully has ownership, if not co-ownership, of the winning hearts and minds strategy. Because if you look at it, the British Army also followed the winning hearts and minds strategy in Malaya also during the counterinsurgency campaign. But we haven't articulated it well enough for it to
claimed ownership as well as rolled it out also in a more coherent way. So this book of course talks about the military operations post 1972, and of course the Naga, the Northeast insurgency issues has been covered, but so this is you also covered the Nathula skirmish. Now that happened before 72. Why has that been covered here?
When I wrote India's Wars, a military history from 47 to 71, it followed the theme of conventional conflict. So I've covered all the 4 conventional wars that you mentioned in great detail. And by the time I finished, I realized I had over 450 pages. And that's when a few readers came back to me and said that so if you're going to write something in the future, please write something about the Northeast insurgencies, because the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force have been extensively involved, and also about the Nathula crisis. And that's why I've covered a little bit of the Northeast insurgencies, at least the pre-1972 period, because that's a very, very important period. And 1967, of course, how could I have left it out? The 1967 Nathula incident was the first time that the Indians displayed real spine vis-a-vis the People's Liberation Army.
And this was just 5 years after
1962.
After the 1962 war. So when you say it was the first time that the Indians actually showed their spine and stood up to the PLA, why would you say that? What did the Indians do? Of course, I completely agree with you, but for our viewers, what did the Indians do that actually made them stand up with their spine intact against the Chinese?
The whole crisis started off over the Indians laying a fence at Nathula. And the Indians were laying a fence because the preceding months after the 1965 war saw heightened activity of the Chinese all along the Sikkim border. And the Chinese were getting a little worried about India's involvement in Sikkim. So when the Chinese political commissar came in to object against this, the Indians held firm. They continued with the fence line. There were a few scuffles that took place. In that scuffle, the political commissar from the Chinese side, I think, fell down or got hit.
Yeah.
So they quietly withdrew, and the Chinese opened up a blistering machine gun as well as mortar fire on the Indian positions.
Yeah.
The Indians took heavy casualties in the first round, in the opening volley of fire from the Chinese.
Yeah.
But after that, the response of the Indians was so fierce, with all kinds of artillery and machine gun fire being rained back on the Chinese, that the Chinese casualties over the next few days far surmounted that of the Indians.
That of the Indians, true.
And it was primarily because of extremely firm division level and brigade level leadership, who stood firm and said that we fight fire with fire.
And sir, exactly 10 years later, there was another issue between India and China in 87.
Yeah, 20 years later.
Sorry, 20 years later.
Yeah.
My apologies. 20 years later, there was another issue. And here again, of course, as you rightly mentioned, in 67, it was the brigade and division commander level leadership, the strong leadership, that they refused to budge. It was visible in 87 also. What happened in 87, sir?
Again, that's a favorite chapter of mine, for the pure and simple reason that my primary source for writing this operation was the man on the spot.
Yeah.
And the man on the spot was Major General Jimmy Singh, JM Singh, the divisional commander of 5 Division based at Tenga. Now, here again, this was an operation that was actually initiated and alerted by the intelligence agencies. There was something known as an SIB that always used to be in Wangdong, and they are the ones who alerted General JM Singh that look, there's something fishy going on there. So you see that for any successful operation, every link has to work.
And coordination with each other.
Here you had an intelligence input which was immediately taken cognizance of and not ignored by the immediate military commander. The military commander took his own initiative first by positioning a battalion overlooking that particular small thing, and then he went back to his corps commander to say that, look, we need to expand this operation. We can't just leave it as a small operation. We need to expand this operation to show the Chinese that we also have the spine, or we also have the wherewithal to be able to deter, and deter effectively. So the corps commander was fully supportive of his divisional commander. And on top of that, you had an army chief who was supportive of the entire operation. You had an Air Force chief who immediately rushed in Mi-17, the latest Mi-17 helicopters to support the operation, which were just inducted. The Bofors was inducted for the first time operationally into the Tawang sector. It was actually earmarked for the Sikkim sector, but they diverted a few guns to come into the Tawang sector.
It had just been few months that the Bofors had come
Exactly. And so gradually General Narhari, who was the corps commander, was an engineer officer. So the first thing he did was to pump in resources for infrastructure. What is being seen today being done on a massive scale was done on a smaller scale, but with great amount of speed.
And at that time it was the Indian Army soldiers who built that track.
Exactly. You saw there are some photographs of mules and things like that.
Yeah.
So that was a phenomenally effective and well orchestrated operation.
So the past experiences, of course, what happened in 67, what happened in 87, shows the fact that every time India stands up to the Chinese is only when the Chinese withdraw or Chinese realize. And this is something that happened in 2017 in Doklam 2, which is again covered in detail in this book by you, sir. So how do you see Doklam?
You see, Doklam was a case of preventive deterrence. Alert field commanders, decisive instructions from an army commander from the army commander who quickly alerted New Delhi to say that he needs authorization or he needs permission to go across. Otherwise, it could prove ominous for the occupation of the Jampheri Ridge.
Yeah.
So the eye was on the ball, and that ball was Jampheri Ridge. What do we need to do to ensure that the PLA does not occupy the Jampheri Ridge? We have to engage in a bit of crossing the line of actual control, probably going into Bhutanese territory, in order to prevent the Chinese from setting out to achieve what their objective would have been. Let me assure you, their objective would have been to creep in slowly towards the Jampheri Ridge.
Yeah.
So I think from a preventive deterrence case, it was it was a well executed operation, and whatever others may say, but I think Doklam triggered off. I think Doklam was one of the triggers for payback in 2019.
And this is exactly in 2020.
2020. Yeah.
And this is exactly what I was going to ask you, whether in your, you've of course served in the Air Force, but you also a military historian and who've studied India's relationship with China, the standoffs that I've taken very deeply. So in a way, your opinion is also the fact that whatever happening now, actually it's the roots of this particular standoff lies in what happened in 2017.
That would be putting it very simplistically. Any such event has several triggers.
Yeah.
One of the triggers, I'm certain, would be Doklam, but not the only trigger. The other triggers have far more deep-rooted origins. I mean, say for example, this intrusion into eastern Ladakh is also part of an old Maoist strategy which is called expanding your five fingers.
Yeah.
It's part of your five fingers. It is Xi Jinping's way of exercising power. It is the Chinese way of securing their periphery. So Doklam, yes, I personally feel is one of the triggers, but not the only trigger for the current set of operations that the PLA has conducted in eastern Ladakh.
So, this book, of course, also delves into what is known as the gap crisis area. And initially when I first read this, gap, I was wondering what does gap stand for? And gap, of course, stands for the Galwan Pangong crisis, the Pangong Tso crisis. And, this book also takes into account the clash that happened in June 15. So this is as updated as a book can ever be before actually going in for print. So when this whole incident started off, in May, when the Chinese, of course, you had one in Sikkim and a clash that happened in Galwan. Do you believe that India was slow to reacting to this Chinese aggression?
The thing is, there has been a lot of criticism about the pace of the Indian response. Okay, I was one of the early commentators who believed that that one can't sort of immediately criticize the Indian response, because you have to look at the Indian response from the prevailing global situation and the pandemic that took place.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think one should not be too harsh on the Indian state for reacting in the way it did. Okay. Because any other kind of reaction would have been against our DNA, which is inherently we are slow off the block. Inherently, we are a little slow off the block when it comes to operations other than war.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think the subsequent responses that have taken place have very, very seriously dented PLA expectations of what they set out to achieve when they started these multiple sort of operations across the line of actual control.
You're referring to what happened on the 29th and 30th of August.
Absolutely, absolutely. I am of the opinion that it was a very, very carefully deliberated operation. It took into consideration all the issues that even Clausewitz would have been happy with in terms of logistics, in terms of planning, in terms of contingencies, in terms of being prepared for the worst case scenario. And I think any operation that would have been launched as a knee-jerk reaction to either public outcry or calls from within the military or would have been suboptimal. And I think the operational outcomes and even the strategic outcomes of these deliberately executed operations far outweigh the time gap between June 15th and July 31st.
So one more thing, if you go through all the operations, and one thing that consistently stands out, except for what happened in 87, was the fact that there was lack of coordination between the intelligence agencies, between the army and the Air Force. So you had all these three agencies in a way working in a very in silos, and with very less coordination than what one would have expected. However, if you look at the current standoff, you have a situation in which I know for the fact that the three service chiefs meet regularly, almost on a daily basis, to take stock of what is happening in Ladakh. And I am for the first time seeing a very well coordinated response in the sense of between the Air Force and the Army in terms of logistics, in terms of troop movement. Is this something that you will also agree with, sir?
Oh, absolutely.
This operation has brought about?
Absolutely. I think this operation that took place on 31st July and 1st August has been has boosted the confidence of the Indian Armed Forces. It has made them believe in themselves that they can respond to multiple contingencies across the line of actual control. In fact, some of the statements of the Chief of Air Staff also have clearly indicate that that notwithstanding the reduced squadron strength and things like that, the capability exists to handle a two-front situation adequately, more than adequately. The kind of air activity that you now see in Ladakh has never been seen before.
Exactly.
Has never been seen before. In fact, one of the army officers whom I spoke to very recently says, I've never seen so much of air over me. And he told me, he says, what inspires most confidence in a soldier on the ground is that if he sees air above him. And I think that is something that is quite reassuring. And I think the kind of intelligence that was provided that allowed us to preempt the Chinese while occupying the heights.
Yeah.
So I think things are falling in place, and we just need to just give a large state like India, also a democracy, unlike the People's Republic of China, which is a communist autocracy.
Yeah.
Will have to get their act together the way we are getting it together. So that's the bare reality of our situation.
So coming towards the end, we've covered a whole lot of operations, and this book talks about one Mr. X, who was part of the IPKF operations.
Yep.
So of course you've not identified the person in this book, but who is this Mr. X? A very intriguing character, viewers. X.
He was an Indian Army officer in military intelligence, Tamil speaking, and who who managed to convince the LTT that he was a sympathizer and that he sympathized with their cause.
And he got in as a journalist.
Yeah, he got in as a journalist.
Yeah.
And it is quite revealing, it's quite revealing to see how indoctrinated the LTT cadres, even the female cadres, were.
When they barged into his room at night.
Exactly. So this guy actually risked his life, managed a meeting with Mahathir, Prabhakaran's deputy. Managed to spend a few nights in the house of a LTT cadre, and brought back fairly critical information back to 54 Infantry Division at Palali, to say that look, things are not very good.
And he went in multiple times into into thing. So yes, so if you want to know more about what Mr. X did, and there are more such insight into much deeper insight into various operations that India has done, do go ahead and grab a copy of the full spectrum India's Wars 1972-2020, written by, but of course, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, and published by Harper Collins. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Snesh, for having me over.